My name is Abigail. I am 22 years old, and finally, I can say that my life now belongs only to myself. Although, to be honest, I do not know what to do with this feeling. I just graduated from college and returned to the house in which I grew up, but despite the familiar walls, creaking floorboards, and the familiar smell of old books mixed with a slight bitterness of wood, this place has not felt truly native to me for a long time. Perhaps it's because the house belonged to my mother, not me, or that I inherited it not by chance, but as a reminder that life can take everything you love away from you without asking if you're ready for it. My mother was a person who loved order in everything, who always thought ahead, and even many years before her illness knew that one day she would have to leave me alone. So when she was diagnosed, she had already done everything necessary so that I would not be left with nothing. "This way, you'll always have a home," she once told me in a flat voice, as if she were talking about something mundane. But even then, a few months before her death, I felt that there was something more behind that calm intonation: fear, pain, helplessness in front of something that couldn't be done. Prevent it. It wasn't always that difficult, but to be honest, my life has never been easy either. My parents' marriage lasted 10 years, and although I would like to say that those years were happy, the memories of them are clouded by a haze of childhood misunderstanding, in which my father was always there, until one day he simply left, packing his bags. I was 9 when he told my mom that he had fallen in love with another woman, but strangely enough, there were no scenes, no quarrels, no lengthy legal proceedings, no custody battle. He just left, as if he had never been a part of our lives, and since then my mom and I have become accustomed to being together. And his presence was reduced to rare calls and postcards for the holidays. However, despite his absence, he did not give up his responsibility, or at least the part of it that concerned the financial. He opened an account for me and immediately transferred there the entire amount necessary for my college education, and I think it was his version of alimony. He started a new family pretty quickly. His wife, Linda, gave birth to their daughter, and although I sometimes visited them in their spacious but uncomfortable rented house, I never really felt like I belonged in their new life. Linda was busy with the baby, listing her latest achievements with that pompous pride that is characteristic of young mothers, and my father worked, claiming that he had to provide for the family, and it always amused me that I was no longer included in this concept. "Abigail, would you like to join us for dinner?" Linda would ask, but there was always a hint of hope in her voice that I would decline, and in the end it all came down to formalities: the occasional birthday greeting, the obligatory holiday cards, and a couple of forced family dinners where everyone tried to pretend that everything is fine. Mom earned enough to provide for us, but when she was diagnosed, she immediately quit to focus on treatment. I was 14 when I found out that our lives would now be divided between hospital visits, therapy sessions, and waiting for test results. But my mother never complained, just kept fighting, kept planning, and made sure I was okay. But cancer, alas, didn't care. Her plans. I was 18 when she died, just a few weeks before I was supposed to leave for college in another state, and if I thought I could do it before, that everything would work out for me, then after her death I could barely function. I do not know what exactly I expected from my father at that moment, perhaps nothing, but he unexpectedly took the initiative and offered his help. Linda and my stepsister had temporarily moved into our house to help me cope with my loss, and although it seemed strange to me at first, I was too broken to ask questions and too grateful for any support I could get. "We can help you get through this," my father said, gently putting his arm around my shoulders, and Linda nodded, trying her best to look sympathetic while my stepsister curiously looked around the house that now belonged to me. By the end of the summer, I was faced with a dilemma. College was starting in a few weeks, and I had no idea what to do with the house, the very house that was the last thing I had left of my mother. The idea of selling seemed unbearable, but leaving it empty for 4 years didn't seem reasonable either, and that's when my father proposed to me over breakfast. I looked at my father, who, pushing aside his coffee mug, was carefully watching my reaction, as if trying to guess in advance what I would say, and despite all the surprise of his proposal, I could not deny that it really made sense. Because if he, Linda, and Sophie stayed here, in a house that it would hurt me to see empty, I won't have to worry about bills or anything happening to it while I'm in another state, focused on studying and trying to build my own life. I turned my gaze to Linda, who was standing at the stove deftly turning pancakes in a pan, and when she felt my gaze, she turned around and smiled. This smile was soft, almost homely, as if she already imagined how everything would turn out, and it suddenly seemed to me that maybe this really was the best option. For all of us. "That would be good for all of us," she said, putting the spatula aside. "Sophie is already enrolled in the local school, and the house will be well taken care of." I must have been silent for too long, thinking about his words, because my father cautiously added, "You might think, Abigail, we don't want to put any pressure on you." But in fact, I had almost nothing to think about, because despite all the doubts, despite the not fully realized anxiety, I understood that this was really a logical and practical decision. After all, during the 2 months that they lived with me after my mother's death, I had already managed to get used to their presence, to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and toast with honey in the kitchen in the mornings, to the sound of Sophie's clear voice telling me something inspiring, to the fact that Linda, although she wasn't trying to replace my mother, was still caring and caring. And looking back, I realized that at that moment it really seemed to me that this was the perfect solution. I began to sort through my mom's things, carefully putting everything that seemed too personal to leave in plain sight into boxes and putting them in the attic, a place where the memory remained safe, but did not press on my chest every time I entered the living room. My father helped me without saying a word, only occasionally cautiously asking if I wanted to keep some of my things for myself. And when everything was packed, I felt strangely relieved, as if I had finally accepted the inevitable. And then I left for college, confident that I had made the right choice. The next 4 years flew by almost unnoticed. My studies consumed me completely, but I never felt disconnected from home, because every Christmas, every summer vacation, I returned back, and each time the house was filled with more and more memories of my mother, but also new moments related to the family that I might not have expected it. But she seemed to accept me into her ranks unconditionally. Linda always greeted me with big welcome dinners, smiling as if I were really her own daughter, and not just her husband's eldest daughter. "I made your favorite lasagna," she said, putting a hot, fragrant baking tray on the table, and every time I was surprised at how easily she pronounced it, as if she always knew about my preferences. Sophie always dragged me to her room, sitting me on the bed and showing me her latest drawings or talking about drama at school with such passion, as if it was the most important thing that happened in her life. At Christmas, we all decorated the tree together, and my father lifted Sophie so that she could attach a star to the top, while Linda and I half-jokingly argued about whether this star was classic or tasteless. We were sitting by the fireplace, drinking hot chocolate, and I found myself thinking that sometimes, even for a short time, I almost forgot that once everything was different. The summer passed in a warm, relaxed atmosphere. Sophie and I spent our days by the pool. I helped her with summer reading, and Linda, without losing her friendly manner, invited me to meetings of her book club, where we cheerfully discussed another love affair. I remember once overhearing Linda telling her father, "Your daughter is so good with Sophie. It's great to have her home." And from this simple confession, which was not intended for my ears, warmth spread inside me. It really seemed to me that we had become a family. During the school year, we continued to keep in touch. Weekly calls with my father asking about my classes and plans, conversations with Linda about the house, where she mentioned that, The roses you planted, Abigail, are blooming beautifully. And video calls with Sophie, who kept me updated on school news. Everything seemed to have turned out perfectly. This strange but surprisingly solid family that arose on the foundation of my mother's house. This life in which I no longer had a place for loneliness. These plans for the future that now seemed so understandable and achievable. And then everything started to fall apart. But I think that's the essence of houses. No matter how solid their foundations are, you can never know what's going on behind the walls. I returned home with my diploma in my hands, ready to start a new chapter of my life. No longer a student, but an adult woman who had a job, a well-established career and confidence in the future. Marshall and Brooks Financial, the company I dreamed of working for, interviewed me through Zoom a few months before graduation, and I was not just offered a job. They accepted me almost immediately, making an offer that was impossible to refuse. Everything was perfect. Or at least that's what I thought at the time. The taxi driver dropped me off right in front of the house, and I stood on the sidewalk, letting the warm June sun warm my face, inhaling the familiar scent of flowers that my mother had lovingly planted long before the disease began to take away her strength, and looking at the house, which, despite all the years of my absence, still he was the only place I could call my own. The rose bushes that she had once tended with such care were still in full bloom, although it seemed to me that they had been cared for a little differently. They looked neatly trimmed, but no longer as lush, not as naturally overgrown, as if my mother were still here and took care of them herself. It was as if someone was trying to keep order, but didn't know all her little secrets that made these flowers so alive. The lawn was neatly manicured, the windows were clean, but new curtains were now hanging on them, small changes that had occurred imperceptibly during my time in college, but still caught my eye, as if someone was gradually replacing one reality with another, slowly but surely displacing the old, familiar past from the house. Rolling my suitcases down the path, I already imagined how I would sleep tonight in my old room, surrounded by things that hadn't changed in years, breathing the air that always seemed safe to me. But as soon as I reached the door and took out the keys, I suddenly realized that something was wrong. The key, he just wouldn't turn the lock. I tried again, pushing a little harder, thinking that maybe the fatigue after the trip was affecting my motor skills. But no, the metal was stuck in the lock, as if it just didn't fit, and for a second I had a strange, unpleasant feeling, as if I was trying to enter someone else's house instead of my own. What the hell? I muttered, frowning, trying again. But when it didn't work again, I gave up and knocked on the door, deciding that maybe one of them had changed the locks and just forgot to inform me about it. The door opened almost immediately, and Linda appeared on the threshold, wearing a faded kitchen apron, and her hands were covered in flour, as if I had caught her right in the middle of cooking. Her face, at first surprised, was immediately replaced by an expression that seemed to me. It was strange, as if my appearance was not just unexpected for her, but also something undesirable. "Abigail, what are you doing here?" she said, blinking, and then, as if catching herself, she added, "What are you doing here?" I silently wheeled my suitcase inside, noticing how in the living room my father was sitting in his armchair, the same one that once belonged to my mother reading something on a tablet, and Sophie was lazily sprawled on the couch with her phone in her hands. But as soon as they noticed me, their faces also changed. Not in a joyful smile, not in relief, but in a strange, confused expression that made something inside me clench uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" I asked, looking around, noticing that there had been changes in the living room too, different pillows, a new vase on the table, furniture rearranged slightly differently than I remembered. "I live here. Why did they change the locks?" My father quickly ran his hand over his neck. I knew this nervous habit of his, which he had retained since his youth, and when he spoke, there was something cautious in his voice, as if he was preparing for a conversation that he had long wanted to avoid. "Oh, yes," he said, lowering the tablet to his lap. "I changed them last month, for safety. You know there have been break-ins in our neighborhood." "You could have told me," I said, trying not to show the irritation that was beginning to rise inside. "Or at least send me a new key. This is my home." I heard Linda sigh, and when I turned around, I saw her crossing her arms over her chest, as if she didn't like the turn the conversation had taken. "We weren't expecting you," she said carefully, wiping her hands on a towel. "Why not?" I asked in surprise, looking from her to my father. "I graduated last week. I told you that I'm coming home to start a new job." I could feel a strange, invisible tension in the air. Sophie even put down her phone, watching our conversation with such an expression on her face, as if she felt that something was going wrong. "Abigail," her father suddenly intervened, standing up. "Can we talk in the office? Wait a minute." I followed him in silence, although questions were already boiling inside. But I waited until he closed the door, until he turned to me, and only then did I see how his hands were trembling slightly. "Listen, honey," he began, lowering his gaze. "There's something you need to know." I felt something tense inside me, but I didn't have time to say a word because he continued. "Linda, well, Linda thinks this house belongs to me." I frowned, not understanding what he was getting at. "What?" "She thinks that after the divorce I gave this house to your mother just out of the kindness of my heart, that legally he was still mine, and when your mom died, he came back to me." I froze, staring at him as if I couldn't believe my ears. "But that's not true," I said slowly, feeling anger rise in my chest. "I know," he said, closing his eyes for a second, as if he was preparing for something difficult. "But she doesn't know that. She thinks she's been living here all this time just because I let her." I felt my blood pounding in my temples, my breath catching in shock, because in one moment everything that seemed so solid, so reliable, crumbled to dust, and it took me a whole minute to find the strength to speak again. My first impulse was to rush out of the office and tell Linda loudly that she was mistaken, that the house she was so confidently running belonged to me, that her ideas of my father's generosity were just an illusion, and that her life in this house was not a gracious gift, but only a consequence of the desire to leave him in safe hands while I was studying. Now I understood why she looked at me with such surprise when I appeared on the doorstep. Now it became clear to me why in her eyes I was not the daughter of the owner, but just an unexpected guest, an uninvited person trying to invade their lives. "I have to tell her," I said through clenched teeth, turning toward the door, but at the same moment I felt my father grab my arm. "Please, Abigail." His voice was barely above a whisper, and there was the same pleading in it as in his gaze, which was both tired and strained. "Just give me some time." I pulled my hand away, looking at him in disbelief, but he was already in a hurry to continue. "I'll find us another place to live, I promise. I just need to figure out how to tell her, without ruining our marriage." I almost laughed at the absurdity of his words. "Ruin your marriage?" I hissed, feeling my rage rise. "What about what you're doing to me?" My father didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a bunch of keys, handing them to me with the air of a man offering a truce. "These are the keys to the new locks," he said softly. "Please, honey, just a couple of weeks. That's all I'm asking. Let me handle this in my own way." I stared at him for a long time, almost blankly, not knowing what exactly was talking in me, a desire to give in or banal fatigue. But in the end, I slowly reached out and took the keys. "Okay," I finally exhaled, feeling a strange nausea in my stomach. "But this is crazy, Dad. You understand that, right?" He nodded, and a look of relief appeared on his face. "Thanks, honey," he said. "I'll fix it, I promise." But nothing has improved. It just got worse. At dinner that evening, the atmosphere at the table was so tense that even Sophie, who usually chatted incessantly, looked uncomfortable. Linda kept glancing at me across the table, cold, appraising, with a hint of disbelief, as if trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do. The woman who once baked my favorite cookies and invited me to her book club now looked at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. More potatoes. Sophie suddenly broke the silence, and my father quickly handed her a bowl, clearly trying to diffuse the situation. But Linda, without even looking at me, suddenly spoke. Would anyone mind if I redo the living room? Her voice sounded casual, but I immediately tensed up. The situation here is a little outdated. I gripped the fork in my hand, realizing exactly what she was talking about. She was talking about the furniture that Mom was arranging, about the order she maintained, about the house she had been building for years, and now this house was just a space for Linda that she could change the way she wanted. My father coughed awkwardly, hastily changing the subject, and I didn't say anything, but anger boiled up inside me. The next morning, I got up early to make myself a cup of coffee, and as soon as I filled the cup, Linda came into the kitchen in a bathrobe with disheveled hair, but her eyes were sharp and focused. Abigail, she said, leaning against the counter, I think we need to talk about your plans. I raised my eyebrows. My plans? Yes, she pretended that her tone was light, but I could hear the tension in it. When do you plan to look for a place to live? I sipped my coffee slowly, mentally counting to 10 before answering. Actually, I said, looking directly at her, I've talked to Dad and I plan to stay here for a while. He said he was fine with it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought she was going to start arguing, but instead she just turned and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with a cup of cooling coffee and a growing sense of anxiety. And everything has changed since then. The next 2 weeks were spent in a state of war. Linda has gone from just being cold to being openly passive-aggressive. She accidentally washed my clothes along with colored things, which caused her to shed hopelessly, and every time she shrugged her shoulders, saying that she had simply forgotten which laundry basket was mine. She cooked dinners for exactly 3 people, and when I sat down at the table, she pretended to be surprised, saying I wasn't counting on you. She moved objects around the house, erasing traces of my mother's presence. One day I saw that her favorite vase, which always stood on the mantelpiece, was now on the bottom shelf at the entrance to the hallway. It doesn't fit the new interior, Linda said, noticing that I was staring at the vase. I looked at her, and for the first time ever, I wanted to scream. The worst part was watching how Sophie, my stepsister, who had been sending me memes just a few weeks ago, called in the evenings to ask for advice about boys, and pulled me by the hand into her room to show me the latest drawings, now seemed to imitate her mother, coldly rolling her eyes as soon as I appeared and I was in the room, making a show of sighing and exchanging brief glances with Linda, as if I were an unwanted guest in their house, and not the person who owned it. When she was on the phone with her friends, her voice took on a special arrogance, and she deliberately loudly called me, that girl, clearly hoping that I would hear and understand the hint. But I didn't say anything, just clenched my teeth harder and tried to keep a straight face, not allowing myself to show how unpleasant it was to me. And if the atmosphere in the house was getting more tense every day, then at least my professional life, on the contrary, was gaining momentum. I visited the office of Marshall and Brooks Financial, where I was shown my future workplace, a spacious corner table overlooking the city center. And although I was not particularly attached to I liked the idea of working here, I liked the atmosphere, the friendly staff, among whom Sarah from the risk assessment group stood out. An energetic and cheerful girl who invited me to have lunch together from the very first day. When do you start? What is it? She asked over sandwiches as we sat in a small cafe near the office, enjoying a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. In 2 weeks, I replied, sipping my iced tea. Just enough time to get settled at home. I didn't specify that the word, settle in my case, meant waiting for my father to finally figure out his lies, and trying not to go crazy from the hostility that filled every corner of my own house. That evening, over dinner, I decided to tell my family the date of my first day at work, hoping that this would help restore the atmosphere of normality for a while. But as soon as I said the words, "They showed me my office today. I start work in 2 weeks." Linda put her fork on her plate with exaggerated care, and I knew I wouldn't like what she said next. "Isn't that wonderful?" she said with that special strained smile that appeared on her every time she tried to hide her irritation. "As soon as you receive your first salary, you can start looking for your own apartment. I know several good complexes in the city that are very accessible to young professionals." I felt my stomach tighten, but before I could say anything, I caught my father's gaze. Pleading, full of hidden despair, he literally asked me to keep quiet in order to keep his secret a little longer. I clenched my jaw, slowly slicing the peas on the plate, and said nothing. If I couldn't change the situation at home, then at least I could try to reconnect with old friends who were still in town. Katie and Jessica, with whom I spent my school years, were happy to see me back, and we started meeting for coffee or shopping, finding that rhythm again. Communication that seemed lost during the years of my absence, but as soon as I returned home, I was immediately enveloped in a feeling of discomfort, tension that hung in the air like a heavy, sticky blanket. I could hear muffled conversations in the kitchen or living room, which immediately subsided as soon as I opened the door. I noticed how my father and Linda hurriedly hid papers when I entered the room, and unnatural smiles appeared on their faces, like children caught doing something forbidden. And then came that strange Saturday. I woke up in a house shrouded in silence, so dense and unnatural that I immediately felt uneasy. There were no familiar morning sounds of Linda, clattering dishes in the kitchen, no music coming from Sophie's room, no noise of the TV, where my father usually sat watching the morning sports edition. I threw off the covers and, without bothering to change, went downstairs in my pajamas, checking every room along the way, but there was no one in the house. The kitchen looked spotlessly clean, but not just clean. It seemed unused, as if no one had entered it since last night. The living room was empty, the pillows were in neat rows, without a single hint that someone had been sitting on the couch since morning. There were no Sophie's boots in the hallway, which were usually lying in a mess at the entrance, and there were no bags that Linda always left on the bedside table. I stepped to the window and looked out into the driveway. My dad's car wasn't there either. I took out my phone, but there wasn't a single message on the screen, not a note, not a single hint of where everyone had gone. The first thought was obvious. They might have gone to breakfast, but it immediately seemed strange to me, because in all these years they had never left the house without a note or even a text message, even despite the current tension. I stood in the center of the living room, feeling an alarm rising inside, some kind of sticky, persistent pressure on my chest, and at that moment I still didn't know what had happened, but I already felt that something was wrong. I tried to call my father first, hoping that, despite all this strange silence, he had simply forgotten to warn me that they had gone somewhere. But as soon as the connection was established, there was a short beep, and then an automatic voice informed me that the subscriber was unavailable. I frowned, trying again, but the result was the same voicemail, a flat, emotionless voice offering to leave a message, but I didn't even know what to say. The lump in my stomach tightened. An unpleasant feeling of anxiety spread across my chest, but I decided to try again, now dialing Linda's number, and this time the wait dragged on 3 long rings. 4, I was about to hang up when suddenly there was a click, and a familiar voice was heard on the phone, but it sounded different. More than usual, sharp, dry, soaked with obvious irritation. "What do you want?" I froze for a second, not expecting such an abruptness, but then I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I just wanted to know where everyone is, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the uncomfortable feeling in my chest. I woke up and there was no one at home. There was laughter on the phone, low, unpleasant, laced with such outright mockery that my stomach clenched. And before I could say anything, Linda spoke up. "Oh, didn't we tell you? We are in the Maldives." I blinked, not immediately realizing the meaning of her words. "What?" "First class, luxury resort, everything," she continued in the same tone, which sounded so pleased that I suddenly felt cold. "We didn't tell you because, to be honest, we didn't want you to follow us and expect us to pay for you." I opened my mouth to protest, but she cut me off before I could get a word in. "It's not like you know anything about paying for things, right?" "What do you mean?" I felt my fingers tighten around the phone. "Oh, please, Abigail." Her voice was suddenly filled with such venomous weariness that I shuddered. "I'm already tired of playing this game. You're just a lazy freeloader living in our house as if it belongs to you." I sat down on a chair, my mother's chair, actually, because my knees suddenly became too weak to hold me, and my hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold the phone. "Linda," I began, but she interrupted me again. "No, you listen to me," she said through clenched teeth, her voice low, almost hissing, steeped in the kind of contempt I'd never heard from her before. "Your father never loved you. You were just a burden to him. He's already spent enough money on you, paid for your college, and now you're sitting in our house like some titled princess who thinks she deserves everything." In the background, I heard Sophie's soft laugh, a giggle that had something particularly humiliating in it, and then my father's muffled voice, but I couldn't make out his words. The cold that ran through my body felt like a physical blow, but before I could react in any way, Linda continued, and now there was not even a shadow of restraint in her voice, only outright anger. "When we get back," she said, and every word she said sounded like a sentence, "I want you out of the house." I tried to breathe in, but the air got stuck in my throat. "What?" "You're packing your things and getting out of our house." Her voice got lower, quieter, but that only made it scarier. "If you're still here when we get back, I'll throw you out myself, and trust me, I won't be gentle." I clenched my teeth, feeling a wave of rage begin to rise in me, but before I could say a word, Linda added, "I don't care where you go. Live on the street, I don't care. You're not our problem anymore." Everything was mixed up in my head, anger, shock, a sense of betrayal, but when I was about to object, she said the last, final thing. "And don't try to call your dad. He agrees with me. He's just too weak to say it to your face." My breath caught in my throat for a moment. "We have already blocked your number." I heard her voice tremble, not from emotion, but from sheer pleasure at the words she uttered. "I wish you a good life, Abigail. Or not. To be honest, I don't care." There was a short beep, and she hung up. I stayed in the kitchen, holding the phone in my hand, as if hoping that if I stared at it long enough, I would see a message from my father, a rebuttal, an explanation, an excuse, but the screen remained blank, and the buzzing in my ears drowned out all other sounds. I do not know how long I sat there, a minute, an hour, forever, but at some point the shock began to give way to rage. They lived in my house, in the house where my mother worked, in the house she left for me, and they had the nerve to call me a freeloader. Did they think they could just throw me out? Well, I'm tired of playing along with my father's lies. I blocked their numbers on my phone, feeling how anger, now cold, methodical, and almost sobering, burned out the remnants of the old pain. And without wasting time, I began to go around the house, collecting their things, Linda's expensive dresses and silk blouses, her endless jars of creams, perfume bottles, books that she left Sophie's school supplies, her clothes, her gym clothes, notebooks with crooked hearts painted on the fields, Dad's golf clubs, his stacks of magazines spread out by the armchair, his collection of old watches on the coffee table in the living room. Everything they considered their own was now neatly stacked in boxes and suitcases. I worked tirelessly all Saturday. The fuel for me was anger and bitter disappointment, and by Sunday morning I had collected their lives, put them in boxes, taped them up, and moved everything to the garage, where these things were now waiting for their owners, who had to face the reality they had tried so hard to escape. I didn't wait for them to return. Instead, I found a 24-hour locksmith who could come immediately, and when he replaced the locks on all the doors, I stood with my arms crossed over my chest, watching him work. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like a decision-maker, not a hostage to other people's games. It cost a fortune, but when he handed me the new keys, and I handed him my credit card without hesitation, feeling strangely satisfied with this small but important victory, I knew it was worth it. And on Monday morning, I started my new job at Marshall and Brooks Financial, and for the next 2 weeks I immersed myself in learning the basics, adapting, and meeting colleagues, among whom Sarah stood out, now not only my mentor, but also my first real friend in a new place, and all this for a while. I consciously tried not to think about the impending clash, about the inevitable moment when Linda, Dad, and Sophie would return and realize that I was no longer going to play along with their lies. I kept their things in the garage without touching them, but the house itself has changed during this time. I rearranged the furniture the way my mother did, removed the tasteless figurines that Linda brought, returned my mother's favorite vase to its rightful place on the mantelpiece, removed new curtains that seemed alien to me, and I hung up the ones that my mom and I used to pick up. And then Friday came. I drove up to the house after work and immediately saw them. They were standing by the driveway, having just returned from their paradise vacation, with suitcases still in their rented car. My father looked nervous. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders hunched, as if he expected the worst in advance, while Linda blushed, her face contorted with rage, and Sophie, standing a little to the side, frowned with her arms crossed over her chest. I hadn't even gotten out of the car when Linda suddenly screamed, "How dare you change the locks? How dare you lock us in our house?" I calmly walked past them, taking my keys out of my bag and putting them in the keyhole, completely ignoring Linda, who was still screaming, who was now literally following me, spraying poison all the time. "We're calling the police. This is breaking and entering." I finally turned to face her, feeling something snap inside me, as all the anger that had accumulated over the past weeks, all the suppressed emotions, all the unfair accusations suddenly formed into a single, crystal-clear realization. "No, Linda," I said flatly, but there was steel in my voice. "This is not your house. He never was." She froze, her face contorted with bewilderment and barely concealed fear. "This house belongs to me. My mother bought it before she met my father. She left it to me in her will. The only reason you lived here is because I temporarily allowed it." Linda laughed, but it was an uncertain, nervous laugh, and she immediately darted a glance at her father. "Tell her she's lying," she demanded, and for the first time there was not anger in her voice but panic. "Tell her this is our house." But the father did not look up. His shoulders slumped, and he only shrugged weakly, shifting uncertainly from one foot to the other. "She's telling the truth," he said softly, not meeting her gaze. "The house, it's always been hers." I saw emotions change on her face, first rage, then something that looked like calculation, then a sudden change in the expression of her eyes, as if a switch had been flipped inside her. "Oh, Abigail, honey," she suddenly said, forcing a smile that was completely unnatural, strained. "You didn't think I was serious on the phone, did you? It was a joke. You know how I am, sometimes I can lose my temper, and you know all this sunshine, these tropical cocktails, probably went to my head." "Stop it," I said softly, but she took a step toward me, holding out her arms as if she were going to hug me. We're a family, remember. All these wonderful times, book club meetings, holiday dinners, we can take it all back. But before I could answer, my father's voice rang out, hoarse with emotion. Princess, he took a step forward, his gaze pleading, I'm so sorry. I know I handled it wrong. But I love you, you're my daughter. Please, can't we solve this somehow? I looked at him, at his trembling hands, at his tired face, at his attempts to maintain at least the illusion of peace. And at that moment, I realized that there would be no more peace. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in a long time, allowing myself to see him as he really was, and not as I wanted him to be, the man who left our lives when I was only 9 years old, who provided me with an education, but was never present in my life, who lied about my house, about my inheritance, about my mother's will, and then stood quietly by while his wife planned to kick me out of the only place that rightfully belonged to me. So what, Dad? What bothers you more? The fact that you lied to your wife about owning my house, or the fact that you were just standing by when she was about to throw me out on the street? Linda immediately turned to me, and that sticky, insincere smile that I had already learned to hate reappeared on her face. Abigail, let's be reasonable, she said in a sweet voice, taking a step closer, as if she still hoped she could convince me. We can all live here together, we'll pay the rent. No, I interrupted her sharply, and there was no hesitation or doubt in my voice. We can't. Your things are in the garage, take them and leave. Linda's face contorted with anger, and the mask finally cracked, as it should have. You ungrateful little bitch, she spat, her voice ringing with rage. After all we've done for you, are you going to throw your own family out on the street? I felt strangely, almost frighteningly calm as I answered. You just spent $10,000 on a luxury vacation that you deliberately hid from me. I'm pretty sure you can afford an apartment. Abigail, please. My father tried to intervene again. His hand trembled as he stepped closer, as if he was going to grab my hand. I know I screwed up, but... No, I interrupted him again, meeting his pleading gaze, but it didn't bother me anymore. You didn't screw up, you lied. 4 years old. My father opened his mouth, but I didn't let him get a word in. You let your wife believe that she owns my mother's house. You stood and watched as she tried to remake it, to erase all traces of Mom, to erase her presence, to replace her with her tasteless vases, her curtains, her rules. And when she decided she could just kick me out, you didn't say anything. I was going to tell her the truth. He began, but his voice sounded weak, uncertain. When? I grinned, shaking my head. After she finished fixing up my house in her own way. My father looked away, and I knew he wouldn't find anything to say. I'm done, I said, taking a step back. Get your stuff and get out. I entered the house and slammed the door in their faces, not even bothering to turn around, while Linda screamed something about ingratitude, about how cruel and selfish I was, but now her words were nothing more than meaningless noise to me. I watched from the window as they took turns leaving the garage with the boxes, loading them into the rented car. I saw Linda still shouting something, her face red with anger. I saw Sophie crying, looking at it as something unfair. I saw my father standing, hunched over like a broken man who suddenly realized that he had lost. It took them 3 trips to pick up everything, and when the last box was loaded into the car, the father made another attempt. He went to the door and knocked softly. I didn't open it. They left when the sun was already setting, and I remained standing at the window, watching the vanishing lights of their car, feeling something like relief, but too exhausted to fully realize it. The next day, my father tried to call from a new number. Abigail, please. His voice was pleading, almost choking. We can fix this. No, Dad, I said, and my heart didn't even flinch. We can't. He paused, and in that pause I heard his breathing, rumpled, strained, as if he understood that this was the end. Linda made it very clear that you all really think of me, I continued. A freeloader, duty, the person you've never loved. He inhaled, but I didn't let him speak. Maybe it was her words, I said, but your silence said enough. 2 months later, I was still living in my mom's house. My house. I repainted the walls in the living room in the shade that my mother always wanted, but never had time to choose. I planted new roses in the garden. I made the house my own again, getting rid of the last reminder of people who thought they could oust me from my own life. Sometimes I thought about them. I wondered where they ended up, how they lived now, whether they were still together. But these thoughts came fleetingly, without pain, without regret, like short memories that no longer had power over me. I was mostly thinking about my mom, about how she always took care of me, about how she had foreseen this moment, even if she couldn't have predicted it, about how she said, "That way you'll always have a home." And it didn't matter to her that someone was trying to take it away from me. Dad still called sometimes, from different numbers, from different phones, but I didn't pick up the phone anymore. Some bridges, when burned down, should remain ashes. It was funny, but I was happier than ever. My work was going well. I've made new friends. And for the first time since my mother died, I felt real peace in this house. Sometimes healing is not an attempt to hold people back, and the ability to finally let them go.